But just to kick things off, Daniel, so again, I'm really excited to sit down and chat with you. I've been a longtime user of DefenderShield products, again, for well over a decade now. And this is certainly a topic that I think so many people need to know about, right? Because it affects our everyday lives. So I just wanted to kick it off by asking you what first inspired you to kind of research and develop these solutions to reduce EMF exposure?
Let me give you a tiny bit of my history. I was in Bell Labs many, many, many years ago, and my business in Bell Labs was developing standards and doing testing for technology. And so it was what was deployed that I had tested and the standards they met. So I was pretty familiar with electronics for quite a number of years. And I guess about, probably over 15 years ago, maybe even more now, my sons, who are adult men, were visiting, and they had their laptop on their lap. And my wife says, "I want grandchildren. That can't be good for you." Now, she was a social worker at that time. And I looked at her and I said, "No, that can't be true. I'm very, very familiar with what's going on, but it can't be true." But both me and my sons said, "Hey, wait, maybe let's take a quick look. Maybe there's something there." And even back then, we knew that there was influence from electromagnetic radiation, or RF, radio frequency stuff, coming off of the laptop with their Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. And even back then, it was known that from scientific evidence that there was 25% male sperm immobility after 3 to 4 hours of use on a laptop. And ironically, I was in the industry writing the standards for the industry, and I didn't know that.
Wow.
And so I had, at that time, retired from the telecommunications space. And we said, well, I'm a mechanical engineer, so I can probably figure out how to shield the emissions from a laptop from a male or female, by the way. At that time, we knew that 2% of females exposed to that had some tumor, some cancerous, some percent cancerous. So it was like, wow, this is pretty serious. So what I did was I designed a laptop shield, which is called DefenderShield, a Defender pad at that time. And I said, well, I can make it for you guys. And they used it. Their friends wanted it. And so I said, okay, well, maybe we'll start manufacturing some of this stuff. Let's make 1,000 of them and see what happens. And made 1,000, and that was the start.
Wow.
It was literally to help my sons have grandchildren, which, by the way, 15 years or so later, I still don't have grandchildren.
Maybe one day soon.
I'm hopeful. I'm still hopeful.
That's an incredible story. In fact, I have my Defender pad in front of me right now. I do not go anywhere without it. And it's funny, even when I'm at coffee shops, people will always ask me, like, what's that pad underneath your laptop? And then I'll go on to explain to them all about EMFs and DefenderShield and what have you.
Yeah, actually, that was the big thing. I don't know if anybody would ever use it because no one knew about it as a potential danger. So I was really concerned from a business point of view. You spend a lot of money and no one uses it because they don't feel they need to.
Right.
Well, what's interesting about that is slowly but surely, people becoming more aware that maybe there is exposure from the electronics around us. And maybe we should think about protection. What's interesting from there, we went and we started producing the products and we're putting into the market. People were starting to sort of agree that maybe from a conservative point of view, even if they didn't really believe it was truly dangerous, that they needed to be conservative about it, and maybe
Right.
precautionary measures should be taken and they should use it. And that actually started. It was slow early on, but it was slow but true. And then I was reading an article about a young 16-year-old child that was harassing her parents to get a cell phone. And the parents were reluctant to get for their daughter, a very healthy, conscious woman. And I knew that the cell phone at that time was potentially dangerous to the frontal lobe, the front of the head. And so I read the article, and it said how after about a year or so, the daughter actually used it incessantly over that year, and she developed the frontal lobe cancer.
Wow.
And she passed away. And that was, to me, very, very frustrating, because why don't we know about this? Now, it was an isolated case. It may be that it's not truly a problem for the mass market, but science was suggesting even back then the frontal lobe has soft tissue and was more susceptible than other parts of the body.
So interesting.
So I said, look, the technology we developed for our laptop shield, our fender pad, actually would work in a cell phone. And then I started producing cell phones.
Brilliant. Daniel, question for you on the science front. So first of all, I'll let you know, my mom, I feel like, has always kind of been ahead of the curve with all of these health trends, right? Like, she's one of the pioneers who used to shop at Whole Foods. Even before EMF, EMF research and whatnot came out, she always would say, keep your phone on speakerphone, never put it up to your head. Prior to even knowing about DefenderShield or your laptop pads, she would always make us put a pillow on our legs if we were sitting.
Wow.
She's done a lot. She's truly brilliant. She doesn't give herself enough credit. But she was always kind of, informing us of, okay, these are things you can do to help mitigate the risk of exposure. But for folks who, like, this is their first time hearing about the term EMFs, you mentioned science before. Can you just share, like, how EMF radiation actually affects our bodies on a cellular level? Because I think education, right, is truly so important when it comes to understanding, like, why should we be avoiding or mitigating the risk of EMFs?
Thank you for asking that question, because it's really the origins of what we want to talk about. I think it's all about understanding the impact of a toxin to the human body. And if you think about it, radio. So let's talk about what it is first. There's two forms of electromagnetic radiation we talk about in our world. And it's this stuff that comes from the wall in your room. That's extremely low frequency ELF, extremely low frequency emissions at 60 hertz. And the wires that run when you have something plugged in, there's electrical current through, and that generates electromagnetic radiation at 60 hertz. So there's that one form, the wires running in your house, the wires running along the road, the big high-powered ones that are very high up, they're generating electromagnetic radiation. So that's one form, which is an important emission that's surrounding us that you need to be thinking about. And then the other was radio frequency, RF. Mm-hmm. It's the stuff that comes from your cell phone, the stuff that a cell phone, for example, you have your cellular connection that goes from your cell phone to the cell tower. That's a physical connection. And then you have Bluetooth. That's an RF signal. It's less power levels, but they are an RF signal. They're about the third power level than a cell phone.
Wow.
And then of course you have GPS. You're generating signals to that are constantly pinging where you are. And then finally, you have Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is an RF signal as well. And that goes from your cell phone to your router.
Right.
So when you pick up a cell phone and you put it to your head, you have 3 to 4 transmitting signals that are touching something somewhere. And the power levels are relatively low. I'll give you an example. A microwave oven operates at roughly 2.3 gigahertz. What is a gigahertz? A hertz is one cycle passing something in 1 second. It's a wave that passes 1 cycle per second. A gigahertz is a billion cycles that passed 1 second. And so, like, if you're looking at the waves in the water at the ocean, you'll see one wave go by, then the second later you see another. That's a cycle.
Wow.
That's a hertz. If in 1 second going past that point, a billion go by, that's a gigahertz, billion cycles per second. That's what your cell phone uses, a billion cycles per second. That's connecting. And so there's the frequency that occurs, and then there's the power. A microwave is roughly 2.3 gigahertz. A cell phone is 1 gigahertz. A microwave at 2.3 gigahertz typically can go up to 1,000 watts. You know, when you go buy a microwave, it says, well, I want a 1,000 watt one. I want a 700 watt one. That's the power that's generating. And then a cell phone is about 1.6 watts peak. It's much, much lower.
Right.
But a
Chronic
microwave,
exposure.
a microwave is a thermal emitting signal. That means it heats stuff up. When when you have a microwave oven, it's heating the water in between cells, heating those cells up, and they begin oscillating really, really fast, and then your meat's cooked. Well, that's what's happening when you put it on your, but the power is much less.
Right.
However, science is pretty clear that there's evidence between external power levels at 1.6 watts influencing soft materials in our human body. We started off with the laptop, and laptop generating a Wi-Fi signal probably around more than 1.6 watts per kilogram can immobilize the male sperm. And in the case of females, less than 2% are impacted by mutated cells, but 1% of that can actually become cancerous. So that's the mechanics in our environment. It's been introduced to our environment for the past 30 years or so. The difference 30 years ago was an RF signal was away from you. You didn't have all these signals
Right.
around you. But today, it's literally in your living room. And there are a dozen in your living room.
Yep.
24 in your living room. And that environment is creating problems for the human body to deal with. It's never dealt with this kind of congestion of RF signals in our environment. And that's where the problem lies.
Yeah.
What can it do? Well, for 10 years or so, there was an increase by 2% compounded every year of frontal lobe cancer. Is it a coincidence? We know it's the soft tissue closest to the cell phone. We know that thyroid. If you have an RF signal, fluoride, and you have a mutated cell in your family lineage, you're 3 times more likely to get thyroid cancer. this is science, we know, very well studied science. In fact, if the body, when exposed to an RF signal, goes into what we refer to oxidative stress, which is where the body's like doesn't know what's going on. So there becomes an imbalance with the free radicals and the antioxidants in the human body. I actually think it's not necessarily oxidative stress. In part, it's oxidative stress. Mm-hmm. But we know from Dr. Navio that the cells respond naturally to a toxin. And the body, every part of the body, is reacting in different ways called cell danger response. And that's actually responding by changing the body's protection,
right,
when it's trying to survive. Just like if you have when you see a bear in the woods, you automatically run. You don't think about it. Well, that's what happens to the cell. So, is this a problem? Maybe. Science suggests it. It's controversial. We know that some industry experts don't believe that. Industry experts being those who provide the service, and then you have independent science, which suggests it's maybe not.
Right.
And so I'll give you an example of Dr. What's his name? Ollie Johansson. A buddy of mine, Ollie Johansson, has been doing research on RF for 40 years. And he actually identified this cell-brain barrier that protects the human body breaking down in the presence of RF.
Wow.
And then that breakdown actually exposes your cells, your frontal lobe cells, to potential dangers more so than others.
And I think that's all so interesting, Daniel. And the first thing that comes to mind too, I mean, when you were talking about, the science that supports all this, is that oftentimes I think just our human nature is that if something doesn't inherently bother us or innately bother us, like if we don't have symptoms, we don't necessarily think it's an issue. But yeah. I think in the context of EMFs, I have quite a few friends who I know are very quote unquote EMF sensitive. Like they'll actually get headaches or other, symptoms if they're, wearing Bluetooth headphones. And is that basically I guess the nature of having that barrier being broken down? Like why are some people more sensitive to EMFs than others?
Thank you for asking that question. It's so when I started this over 15 years ago, it was roughly known that about 15% of us responded to an RF signal in a negative way. Would have, I don't know, we'd have burning sensations, we'd have depression, we'd have fatigue, we'd have dizziness, nausea. We wouldn't sleep well. Our memories wouldn't work. Well, we know because of science studies years ago that about 20% of us would have some form of electric hypersensitivity, is what they call it. And it was a very real condition. In the U.S., it's not acceptable medical diagnosis. In Europe, it is.
Not surprised.
So, yeah. So there's this dichotomy of the world and how they deal with this. And the concentration of RF from the studies done 10, 15 years ago has been much more. And guess what? Electric hypersensitivity has gone up to 50%, some studies suggest. And Jacqueline, 80% of those who are affected are women. And we don't know why.
Interesting.
It's really true. I don't know, you're more the canary in the coal mine than I am, but there's something going on. And it is clearly increasing. And it's serious. Actually, believe it or not, when we talk about this, is it cancerous? Well, there's scientific evidence suggests there is linkage for cancer. But electrohypersensitivity, I'm more worried about that.
Right.
And the reason why is it's pervasive. Not only that, it can be pretty seriously debilitating.
Right.
I work with clinics. One was out in San Diego, and they had someone come into the clinic, and they brought him in on a wheelchair. And Dr. Court, a friend of ours, started looking at him, and he began realizing this guy's electrohypersensitive in an extreme way. Turned out Dr. Court is electrohypersensitive, and so he's pretty responsive to patients who come into his office. And in fact, he became so familiar with it, he ultimately became Dr. EMF. He literally is the expert in the industry, and I've known him for many years.
Interesting.
And that person worked in a building in which it was high power levels of extremely low frequency emissions. So his exposures were extremely high. So they began working with his diet. They began working with exposures. They began working with mitigating exposures, all the things you would do to try to help balance the human body, to try to be more responsive and resilient to exposures.
Yeah.
And they eventually were able to bring this patient, to a normal space. Before I knew Dr. Court, I didn't know any clinicians that could turn around electrohypersensitivity. It was pretty serious back then, and I felt very frustrated. In fact, that's why my son and I wrote a book, Radiation Nation, was because we were so frustrated that no one knew using a cell phone potentially could be dangerous.
Right. Here's a question for you, Daniel. So on the topic of mitigating exposure, you mentioned some common sources of EMF exposure before. Understanding that we can't all live in a bubble, right? Like we live in this world, we're constantly going to be exposed to different types of EMF sources and whatnot. What are some, I guess, just practical steps that someone could take to help mitigate those levels? And I'll share with you a few that I do, a few of my habits, and I tell my followers this too. Every night I unplug my Wi-Fi. I will say I live in an apartment building, so I don't know how effective that is because obviously there's people above and below me, but I do unplug my own Wi-Fi. I always have my phone on airplane mode if I, don't necessarily need to be out and have it connected to cellular data. I obviously use my DefenderShield shielding products. I did recently get a Faraday cage, and I'm really curious of your thoughts on that. I mean, how, I guess, extreme would you go to really mitigate EMF exposures, like at night, for example, when we sleep? And then I have these like stickers that basically are like harmonizers that claim to like neutralize the EMF. So I'm curious of your thoughts on those too. I know that was a lot, but these are the questions I have for you. I was so excited to ask you all of them.
There are devices. I did the testing for the Bell system, so I'm pretty familiar how to verify and substantiate the claims of a product. And I actually went to an FCC laboratory and have them test my product. And the reason why is because I could be biased.
Right.
How could you believe what I gave you is being true? Because I'm the source of the testing. So when it comes to devices, look at the science substantiating the claim. And there are devices that are stickers that they make claims that it mitigates emissions. You need to find the evidence that that's true. I can't find evidence on a lot of them, if not most of them. The claims are a placebo at best. So I do recommend, if you choose to look at devices for protecting yourself, that you look at the study work that's suggested. And by the way, if someone shows you that the red blood cells don't coagulate as much as when shielded, that's not evidence. That's a temporary
Right.
body response. And so I really do recommend you find independent studies on any of those choices. But you touched on a very important point for me, which is the environment. It's all about what you control. You don't worry about what you don't control.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, if your apartment that's adjacent to your building has a Wi-Fi signal, you don't worry about it because you can't do anything about it.
Right.
And by the way, the rules of thumb, 1 to 2 foot away from a signal, 80% of the cell danger is gone. By 4 foot, it's 98. I typically recommend
Interesting.
10 foot minimum for true safety.
Speak on that topic too, Daniel, before I forget, what about cell towers? So when folks are moving, right, they're looking for a new home, obviously if there's a cell tower in the vicinity, you're probably not going to be inclined to purchase that home. But what is a quote unquote safe distance to live from a cell tower?
750 yards.
Okay.
Yeah. There is, so we were talking about a cell phone. Let's talk a little bit more about it. 1.6 watts is the maximum power the FCC allows, right? That was to protect the head of a user. The standard occurred over 35 years ago. They looked at 6-foot males that were in the service, and they said, how much can a signal penetrate a male? 6 foot on the average. And we want to make sure that it doesn't heat up more than 2 degrees. They didn't look at any biological implications, just the thermal implication, like the microwave we talked about. Mm-hmm. And so that was what the standard that prevails even to this day. Well, it represents about 2% of the users.
Wow.
You have women. You have the men who 6 foot and have thick skulls, and they're very hard to deal with oftentimes as a result of it. But then you have the female, maybe not as thick-skulled, but then you have the child that's 6 years old. That signal that can penetrate based on the standard 2 inches into the head goes completely through a child's head at 6 years old. And the standard doesn't reflect any biological. All of the study work over the last 15 years in independent study work is on the biological impact. When we talked about the frontal lobe, we're not talking about heating up. We're talking about a cell response. So 1.6 watts. When you're next to a cell tower, it's over 40 watts. So you really don't want to be near 40 watts. We know at 1.6 watts it's pretty serious. But at 40 watts, the exposure concern is much, much higher. That's why you don't want to be close to that. So let me go back to the other question about what do you do to mitigate? The bedroom is probably one of the most important places in the house that you need to worry about. You don't want anything in that room. You don't want a cell phone. You don't want a Wi-Fi. You don't want any transmitters in that room. You, oftentimes for hypersensitive, even being close to a wall can bother you because of the wiring in that wall. So oftentimes you want to make sure the headboard is not close to that wall because ELF is coming out of that wall. So you want a sanctuary. I was doing a podcast once with a very, very bright lady, and I was telling her the sanctuary or the bedroom is really important. And she was, thank you so much for that information. Really, really appreciate it. She didn't believe a word I was saying. And so about several weeks later, she called me up and she said, "My husband and I, we moved our cell phones off our tables, the night tables, and we're sleeping through the night." I said, "Of course you are, because it really does influence your body, and more importantly, it disrupts the sleeping pattern, which is when your body recovers at night." And so it's important that you create that sanctuary and that you treat it as a sanctuary for all toxins, including RF toxins. So we talked about RF, and we got so much to talk about. But when you use light, when you use a monitor in your bedroom, a tablet, and you're looking at the screen, you've heard of blue light. Mm-hmm. Well, blue light is very close to the transition point from one type of RF, one type of radiation versus another. And so it has power. So when you're looking at a monitor at night, the light is shining into, the blue light is shining into your eye, and it's playing around with the cryptochrome protein. It's actually saying, up, it's still light out. You don't go to sleep yet. So the melatonin and all the other things that have to occur are not occurring because you are tricking your body into believing it's still sunlight. It's the way the body responds for that since we began. And so when you use a tablet, at least an hour before, put it away. And the cryptochrome protein will do its natural thing and turn off the functions and turn on the right functions. So the sanctuary is very, very important. You take all stressors, because they are a stressor, out of the environment, and you should be safe. Now let's talk about other parts of the room. You do everything you're supposed to be doing. You're mitigating the stressor in your environment that you control when you can, turning this off, turning that off. Like with a cell phone, I don't have Bluetooth on, I don't have Wi-Fi on, I have a cell connection. Right. And I keep it over 4 foot away from me, right? Yep. The distance. And I'm always trying to be safe. When I come into the house at night, I put my cell phone at the door. I don't bring it into the house. It's just a precautionary measure I just have in my own home. I have my whole house Ethernet wired. Wow. I don't use Wi-Fi.
That's the goal, Daniel. That's the goal.
Yeah, that's what you want to do. You want to mitigate it. In fact, I talk about this, Jacqueline, as bees in the room. One bee won't kill you unless you're allergic. 1,000 will. Mm-hmm. Well, think about the bees in the room, the RF bee. Your cell phone had 3 of them. Turn 2 of them off, you have 1. So you simply turn them off. Yeah. If you don't need them in that room. And that helps you and your body deal with those exposures. It reduces the level of exposures. And that's a good thing to do as a general practice. Right. And you don't panic when you have a transmitter on the wall outside where you're turning your power. Everyone has the meter concerns. Well, that meter signal is 1 watt. And if it's in the garage, that's 20 feet away from your living area. You don't panic about that if that's the case. You panic if it's on the wall and your bedroom headboard is right in at that wall. That's when you panic, because there's no distance. So you don't panic about this stuff, but you try to mitigate it where you can.
No, I couldn't agree more. And Daniel, I mentioned before Faraday cages. What are your thoughts on those? I have one. I have yet to use it and set it up because it's a little complex, but I'm intrigued to potentially give it a shot. But what are your thoughts on those?
Faraday cages have a a role. They are used by the military to shield their electronic devices.
Interesting.
And if you were an enemy and you wanted to find your enemy that has a cell phone in a Faraday cage, you'll never find it because it can't find the transmitters.
Right.
So it's a cloaking device that's used in the military for not only hiding, but also protecting electronics. And so if you are interested in moving around your area and not be found electronically, that's a great thing to have. If you're looking to protect yourself from the emissions, you can take that cell phone or any other device you have, and you can put them anywhere else outside the room you're in, and that's as much protection as
Faraday cage.
Faraday cage will give you. Right?
Interesting.
And even so, if it's 4 foot more away, you're fairly safe. So do you really need one? Not necessarily. If you're electric hypersensitive, you will.
Yeah.
A lot of people really do because of that. So we have Faraday cages, and we sell them a lot to the industry.
Yeah.
But we also sell a lot to the military.
Very
for that
interesting.
reason.
Okay, well, I'll keep you posted if I give it a shot. It's currently in my closet. Again, haven't set it up yet, but I think I'm doing all the other things to.
I think you're doing
do
everything you should
can.
be doing. Yeah, exactly.
And one other question too for you, Daniel. So going back to Bluetooth, I'm sure you have you cringe, because I know I do every time I see someone walking around with the AirPods or, the Bluetooth speakers. And I'm guilty of it too. I mean, I have a set of AirPods that I use sometimes when I do my podcasting or when I'm lifting weights, but what are your concerns around that? And I mean, I know you mentioned earlier, Bluetooth has about, was it a third of the amount of frequency? So is that still something to be concerned about?
Yeah, it's a third of the power level.
Right.
So a cell phone's 1.6 watts. Bluetooth is 0.4 watts. So is that a concern? Well, probably 8 years ago, I saw a study that showed a frontal lobe that was damaged, DNA damaged, at 0.1 watts. 0.1. So that's 15 times less the power level of a cell phone, and 5 times the power level of a Bluetooth. So is that a problem? I would never use Bluetooth for that reason alone. You're really better off with earbuds that are wired. Earbuds are even better if they're acoustical couplings between the earpiece itself and the speakers to eliminate it completely.
Interesting.
And it's the time domain. Yeah. So you should find protection by putting stuff far away from you as possible. The other is the duration of exposure. So if you're using a cell phone and it's 5 minutes, you're really safe for the rest of your life. It's when you increase the power usage that it becomes more and more dangerous.
Right.
So with your earbuds, which you should never use, by the way, and you're using it for an hour or 2 hours, it's 0.1. It takes 0.1 watts and it's 4 watts.
Right.
And so there's potential danger of frontal lobe concerns.
What about with Bose speakers, Daniel? I have a Bose speaker. I use it sometimes, but if it's far from you, right? But the Bluetooth signal still goes through the air. How does that work?
Yeah, that's all about where it is, right? And where the power levels are. If you have a Bose speaker or any manufacturer's speaker and you're using Wi-Fi, it is most of the time one direction. It's to the speaker. The speaker is not transmitting out. It's only receiving.
Right.
And so they're fairly safe. I mean, if you can avoid it, it tends to be slightly better, but there's not much difference only because time.
Yeah.
They're not transmitting, and they're not, if they do, it's not often.
Yeah. So interesting. And also too, Daniel, one other thing that came to mind, 5G, right?
Oh,
This could be a topic for a whole other conversation.
it is.
But
we'll try.
we hear a ton about 5G, right? Higher frequencies, cumulative exposure. What is the danger of 5G for folks who are like, I don't understand any of the context behind why this is so controversial?
Okay, so the controversy truly lies in the increase of frequency rates with 5G. What do I mean by that? Well, as we've talked about, a cell phone is roughly 1 gigahertz. With 5G, it can go up to 300 gigahertz.
Wow.
Very, very much faster and faster and faster. Example of a concern at 90 gigahertz, for example, is it's used in devices. When we were in college, we were protesting, and someone took a big hose and washed us down. We ran. Well, they have an equivalent of that in modern day, which is an RF signal, which is at 90 gigahertz. And when it transmits to the body, you have your sweat glands act as an antenna at 90 gigahertz. And you get hurt, you're feeling like you're hot, and you run. So that's the modern version of that. In other words, when you get higher rates, we really don't know what's going on, but we do know in some it does impact the human body. So the big concern is we don't know much. We have suspicion that these higher rates can be dangerous.
Yeah.
And we got to be worried about that. Most of the transmission you hear about today in 5G is not those high rates. Most of it is around 1 gigahertz or less, believe it or not. So it's all about the same stuff that's been out there, which is not necessarily good. It's just adding more to it.
Yeah.
Now, that there's a difference when you talk about the service to your house. There is a distribution kind of configuration with 5G that you put a tower right in front of your house. Why? Because the transmission of 5G above 40, 50 gigahertz can't go very far. A cell tower goes 4 or 5 miles. Well, some of the faster rates, as you get higher and higher in frequency rates, say at 40 to 90 gigahertz, they don't go very far. They can only go about 750 feet. How do they fix that problem? They take the power level of what you typically had around your house at 1.6 watts or 40 watts that was 5 miles away to 40 watts in front of your house. That's power level. If you had a child in your front yard, that's never been there before.
Yeah.
So there's a real concern that the power levels that are required to transmit those 5G signals are going to be much, much higher.
Right.
And then satellite.
Yeah.
If you have a satellite communications with 5G, those current designs go up to 80, 90 gigahertz, and they go up to 40 to 60 watts. And that's going to be in your backyard. So I think the concern is all about the new frequency rates and the power levels associated with it.
Right.
That's never been in our environment. Should you be concerned? The answer is yes, in my opinion. But it's not scientific evidence. Why? Because we don't have any research on it.
Right.
No one really knows. Although one thing I haven't talked about is RF, when exposed to the gut, bad bacterium like RF signals, they propagate very well. So the problem we have when you're exposed to an RF signal is the disruption in your microbiome. And if you're electric hypersensitivity, if you have it, there's a high likelihood you have DevC, which is a bacterium, a particular bacterium that actually can be pretty seriously dangerous to the human body.
Wow.
So, but it's interesting how so many who have electrohypersensitive have a DevC increase level. Well,
Wow.
we know at 20 gigahertz, which is the 5G space, there was one study I saw that showed an increased level of bacterium, bad bacterium growth. And so we just don't know much about it, and we should be concerned about it. And if someone wants to activate a service in front of your front yard, don't take it.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And that's why I'm so grateful for all the work that you're doing to educate people on this topic, because it is so very needed.
Yeah.
And also too, Daniel, I've heard you state in previous conversations that the current safety standards for EMF are insufficient and need to be rewritten, right? Yet you just said that might be a bit of a challenge because there's not enough research yet. Are you aware of any research going on right now that will hopefully, I guess, like lend to more or better rather EMF safety standards in the future?
I don't think so. Let me explain a little bit more about that. The FCC, under Wheeler, a previous chair a few years ago, approved 5G using the current standards. And as I explained before, the current standards represent 5% of the use, where 95% are not considered when the standards were developed. So the Kennedy, who is now going to be in the government board here, he actually brought the FCC to court, and him and Dr. Davis brought a suit against the fact that the FCC have not done their legal responsibility of understanding the current understanding of RF signals. And they lost in court. The FCC lost in court because they did not look at the research over the last 30 years.
Wow.
And so I always tell everyone, you're the architect of your own destiny. You don't wait for someone to tell you shouldn't do that or use that in that way, because the FCC, in my opinion, has lagging understanding in litigation as well as regulation for protection of the human using the devices.
Yeah. So interesting. Daniel, this has been such a comprehensive conversation, but I feel like we have only just skimmed the surface. So I do hope to have you back on again at some point. We are coming up on time, and I do want to be conscious of your schedule. But with that, where can listeners find you? Where can they pick up a copy of your book, Radiation Nation, learn more about DefenderShield, all of that?
So it's DefenderShield.com. We are also, of course, we help products in Amazon, but at DefenderShield.com. And the reason I say that is because we have a learning section that we maintain, which is all the research gathered together. So if you have a question of the implication to the eye, or the implication to your stomach, or other diseases, we actually spend time trying to educate through providing that information to our users. So it's DefenderShield.com, and that's where you'll find Radiation Nation as well.
Awesome. And my last question for you, Daniel, and this is my favorite one to ask, and that is, what does being well and strong mean to you?
Know your environment. It really is true that I've seen changes over the years. And I used to love my crisp French fries. And trans fats, which you cook French fries in years ago, was banned in Europe, and it took. This had only been banned in the U.S. for a few years. We used it for 30, 40 years. And so it's like when we have things introduced in our environment, be aware of it, enjoy what it is and bring the values it has, but also be careful and make your own decisions on those external exposures to your internal body. So, in fact, in general, I mentioned this, you're an architect of your own destiny. So you're the one who's responsible for you, no one else.
Love that. Yeah, I mean, the mission of Well and Strong is to encourage readers to be advocates of their own health, and that starts with education, right?
Yeah, so. It really does. It really does. Know your environment.
Yeah.
And don't take someone else's view. Find your own view through knowledge and information.
100%. Well, Daniel, this was so much fun. I truly do hope to meet you at some point in person one day. You got to come visit Greenville, South Carolina. You're not too far.
I will. Yeah, I love Carolinas. I used to go there for years and years and years for vacations down the Carolina shores.
Yeah. Beautiful place. Well, thank you, Daniel. We will chat again soon, but I'm excited to share this with listeners, and I'll let you know when it goes live.
Thank you very much. You have a wonderful day.